Hi, everyone. I'm Bea Arundel, Director of Damascus Citizens for Sustainability, or DCS. Welcome to the latest cooperatively produced webinar of the Delaware River Frack Ban Coalition. The DCS is one of 10 member groups. You will first see pictures submitted through the watershed throughout the watershed to our Delaware River Frack Ban Vacation in the Basin photothon to show the DRBC what we love about our river and its watershed and why we want a full ban on fracking, including waste import and water export. Please send your pictures to the link that will be in the chat. We'll show them in the next webinar. We'll be starting in a couple of minutes after more folks. Welcome to the Delaware River Frack Ban Coalition's summer webinar series. Tonight, we're focusing on the radioactivity in frack waste and how it threatens the Delaware River watershed. Our featured speaker is Justin Nobel, celebrated investigative journalist, author, and activist. We are grateful he has joined us tonight. Links to some of his work will be in the chat. Some housekeeping. Tonight's webinar is being recorded. Please introduce yourself in the chat box and say where you're from. We will be inserting links into the chat to various resources as we go along tonight. Please watch for them, and they will be repeated later. Please use the Q&A box, not the chat box, for questions as you think of them. It helps us make sure we don't miss any questions. Everyone is muted tonight except the speakers, but please write your questions in the Q&A. We want to answer them. All who registered for the webinar tonight will be receiving a follow-up email with a link to the recording and other information. You will be able to take an action tonight. There will be an e-alert after Justin's talk. Stay tuned for that so that you can take an action reminding the DRBC that the governors who are the DRBC voters, that we are their constituents and that we who live here and care deeply about our health and the health of the Delaware Basin want them to enact a full ban. And now here's Tracy Carluccio, Deputy Director of Delaware Riverkeeper Network, who will give a brief summary of where we are in our full frack ban campaign. Tracy?
Thank you, Barbara. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining. So I'm Tracy Carluccio of Delaware Riverkeeper Network, and I'm going to give a brief recap of where we are in our 11-year struggle to completely ban fracking throughout the Delaware River watershed. As most of you know, there was a moratorium on gas drilling and fracking and all its operations in place in the watershed since 2010. This was established by the Delaware River Basin Commission, the agency that is responsible for overseeing the Delaware River Basin and its water supplies. The Delaware, as you probably know, provides drinking water for up to 17 million people every day, including New York City and Philadelphia. And it's a wild and scenic river and a national estuary recognized by Congress. In February of this year, the moratorium was codified into a permanent ban on fracking throughout the Delaware River watershed, an historic decision to prevent the pollution and degradation caused by fracking. After all of us, all of you and us fought for the ban over the last decade, never missing a step. But the DRBC also set up September 30th as the date that they will be issuing draft gas regulations that govern the import of wastewater produced by fracking and the export of water from the Delaware River watershed to other places to fuel fracking. Now, our watershed community has spoken as loudly and clearly as possible to the Delaware River Basin Commission that we want a complete ban, a ban on fracking wastewater storage, processing, discharge, and disposal, and a ban on the withdrawal of water from the watershed to be used to frack up other places. We spoke through 70,000 comments submitted to the DRBC when the proposal was first proposed in 2017. We submitted 100,000 petitions. Many of you signed those petitions to the DRBC commissioners, and countless direct actions and rallies and demonstrations to express our insistence that the only way to truly protect the Delaware River watershed is to ban it all. Now, we are standing on the cusp of the decision that will be made in the coming months. The Delaware River Basin Commission voting members, as Barbara mentioned, are the governors of the 4 states that are part of the watershed. That's New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, and the Army Corps of Engineers, who represents the President of the United States. These 5 members, these 5 votes, will receive the comments and testimony we all submit to them during the public comment period starting after September 30th, and they will base their decision on what they hear. So we need to make certain that they hear the evidence supported by science, by real world data, and by the naked truth about the environmental and public health effects of fracking, wastewater, and water depletion. We will muster our forces as we did in 2017 and 2018 to make our case for a full frack ban. So stay tuned for that intense period of public input that will occur this fall. In the meantime, we are holding these webinars to remind folks of the big issues that we brought up to the commissioners in the past, and to share new reports and data, new evidence, to listen to those who are investigating these issues so we are well armed to make our case when the time comes. We are also sending messages to the Delaware River Basin commissioners through the alerts we are issuing on Action Network at each of these Zoom forums, aimed at influencing these decision makers to do the right thing. We calculate that we have a very good chance of achieving a full ban on fracking. Looking at the governors and how they voted in the past, and now the Biden administration having their representative rather than the Trump administration having a vote as well. We think President Biden will listen as a hometown resident and an ardent fan of the Delaware River and a fan of its irreplaceable assets. He's expressed it before. We think we can get him to express it again through a vote for a full ban. It's up to us to amplify the evidence, to speak our minds, and fight like hell for the Delaware River like we've been doing for the last decades. And that's for our communities and our natural ecosystems. It's for the precious water that is needed not only by us, but by future generations. So we got a lot on our hands, and that's why we're where we're at tonight and where we're going in the coming months, and why the Delaware River Frack Ban Coalition is hosting Justin Nobel as our featured speaker tonight. Justin is a renowned and award-winning investigative journalist and environmental scientist, and his new book on oil and gas radioactivity will be published soon by Simon & Schuster. His reporting in Rolling Stone magazine exposed a dirty and alarming secret that the oil and gas industry has carefully guarded and the government has not regulated and has left hidden from the public. He has exposed that workers are being exposed to radioactivity. Communities and the natural environment are being exposed to dangerous levels of radioactivity from fracking. We will hear from Justin about his 3 years of investigations, and he will share new findings with us tonight, supporting our campaign for a full ban on fracking and its wastewater. He will also be available later in the webinar to answer your questions. So thank you, Justin, and go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much, Tracy and Barbara. Everyone who put this together, everyone attending, it's really a very exciting group to speak to. And yeah, I've been doing research, publishing magazine articles and other investigative articles is one way to get information out. But I think these talks are really important otherwise. So I'm going to share the screen now. And if someone could just confirm that y'all can see this, okay?
That's great.
Okay, super. So yeah, I once wrote about many issues of environmental science, space, and the ocean, and all sorts of things. But for the past 4 years, really, oil and gas radioactivity has been the focus. I presently live in the Northeast. Before this, I was in Louisiana, and I covered the petrochemical industry for many years. So I know this beast that is oil and gas pretty well, but even within that, there was this huge sphere that I was entirely unaware of, and that's this topic, the radioactivity brought to the surface in oil and gas development and the many different pathways of contamination posed to the industry's workers, the public and communities, and the environment. And it's really exceptional to think that, you know, someone can cover the environment, someone can cover oil and gas and miss this world. And it is such a complex and really devastating realm. And I totally missed it. Many journalists, many folks had missed it, but I've been digging in and now working on a book. And so I'm going to give you a peek into some of the research. And I've tried to focus tonight on issues that I know, you know, really affect this group. And this is just really to start to wrap your mind around this topic. This is a wonderful expert I've been in touch with for a couple years now, Dr. Marco Kaltofen, a nuclear forensic scientist. He studied radioactivity from a variety of sources all over the world and focused for many years now as well on oil and gas radioactivity. And this is how Marco describes oilfield radioactivity. Essentially what you're doing is taking an underground radioactive reservoir and bringing it up to the biosphere where it can interact with people and the environment. And that is oil and gas development. We tend to think of the fuel, we think of the things that run off the fuel, our cars and power plants, we think of climate change, but this is also what's happening in oil and gas development. We are bringing radioactivity from underground to the surface of the earth, and the surface is where we live and interact. And so that creates all sorts of problems. And yeah, just, I really think it's so important, especially talking to a group like this, to thank the people out there who are gathering information on these harms. I really follow two different main pathways in my research. I read the science and I follow through to the citations, and then I find the interesting papers mentioned that, you know, led to the current research, and I go back through time and across, and I talk to scientists if they're still around. But then I talk to communities and I talk to people on the grounds, and there would be no information if it weren't for people gathering it themselves. I would not have access. I can't be everywhere. And so I wouldn't be able to know what was happening. And it is courageous. It takes a risk to actually gather information that this, you know, of this industry. You can gather with your eyes, your phones, you know, jot things down. All of this is vital. And it often is, you know, it comes down to your body. You're taking in this information, even if you're not tackled to the ground like this. I know that just observing this industry and recording it can have a trauma on the person. And so I just, really want to appreciate people who are observing and recording, because it is so helpful and so essential for the work I do. And I know that it's challenging, and it takes its toll on people. You are appreciated. So, okay, simple little diagram. I love this diagram. It's obviously, created on a very ancient program, Paint, but it conveys a lot of information, and it really can help describe what the different pathways are for radioactivity that comes to the surface in oil and gas production. And so 3 main pathways. We have produced water, or brine. And again, we have to reconceptualize what oil and gas is. We think of oil and gas, but there's actually this slurry of really salty, toxic water. It's filled with heavy metals. It also has the radioactive element radium that comes to the surface as well with oil and gas. And the industry calls that produced water, or brine. Most wells produce more produced water, or brine, than they do oil or gas. So it's not just this pesky little, thing that comes up in a minor amount. It comes up in a massive amount. Massive amounts of brine come up at every well. They have since the beginning of oil and gas, going back into the mid-1800s in Pennsylvania, and they will continue to. You cannot escape this problem. And I'll get into some of the characteristics of brine in a moment. We also have drill cuttings, huge issue, and this diagram actually conveys why in fracking drill cuttings are so much more of an issue. And I'll just take the time to explain the science here, because I think it's really important. When you have a conventional well, you're dealing with oil and gas that is trapped between rock layers and at pressure. And when you drill into that, the oil and gas, shoots right up. Think of like a West Texas, oil well. It spouts out, it fountains out. With fracking, we're actually going to the mother lode. We're going to the layer that produced the oil and gas that seeped into the trap that the conventional well is tapping. And this oil and gas is still stuck really tight in the formation. And this oil and gas is almost always in a layer, a geologic layer called the black shale. Black shales are these organic rich layers. They form at the bottom of shallow seas, such as the upper part of the Gulf of Mexico. Right now, you have a lot of dead marine algae and organic rich material accumulates. That's your future oil and gas. But embedded in there is radioactivity. We have uranium and thorium, these very long-lived radioactive elements, which decay to all these other interesting, horrible things. They're in there in the black shale. So when you drill a vertical well, you're going through a variety of layers. When you drill what we call a horizontal well, how we frack, you drill down vertically, but then you drill horizontally through the black shale. The black shale is radioactive. So we now are drilling out radioactive drill cuttings. And this is something that regulators have never wrapped their heads around. The industry never really figured out. It's a new issue, relatively new with fracking, and it's really at play in the Marcellus, in the Pennsylvania area as well. And there's so many drill cuttings, it becomes a major waste problem because operators are trying to take these cuttings wherever they can. And they've tried in New Jersey, they are still in New York, and absolutely all over Pennsylvania. Drill cuttings are piling up in landfills, and that's leading to a radioactivity issue there. And then lastly, I won't speak so much about this tonight, but feel free in the question and answer to ask about it. The oil and gas itself, we do have radon, radioactive gas, that's actually moving through the natural gas stream. But I'm going to focus on brine. And again, brine, massive amounts of brine, 2.5 billion gallons a day. And what's amazing is the industry has never had a good plan for dealing with this huge waste stream. And this, when people refer to fracking wastewater, they're often referring to the brine. This is really, and that is the same as the industry's term, produced water. I'll note that those are really kind of innocent words that make this waste stream sound not so bad. Fracking wastewater, I think, gives it a little bit of a better picture. And this, again, is just to show that the US government has known that black shales are radioactive. Here's a USGS paper going back to 1960. So again, really no no reason for folks to be, have their heads stuck so deep in the sand on this issue. We have well-known and really interesting research that goes way back. And I'm just going to get, really nerdy and into the science here. So why is radium, this radioactive element, in brine? And there's a really interesting reason, a geochemical reason, and it's explained well in this paper. It's a complicated paper, but the reason is not so difficult. It essentially has to do with the salt level of brine. Brine is really salty. Even without the radioactivity, brine would really be a toxic substance. It has heavy metals. It also has huge amounts of salt. The salt alone can be toxic, and it turns out that often the salt is an indicator for how much radium that the brine is going to have. So formations with high levels of salt often have high levels of radium as well. And that has to do with, if you think of a rock formation, things like metals, minerals are going to want to attach into the rock formation. Often they don't necessarily want to be in this fluid matrix that is the brine. But if there's a lot of salt, the salts end up taking up a lot of those spaces in the rocks that they're called sorption sites, where different minerals can attach. And when the salt takes it all up, it kicks out the radium. Radium can't be there, and so radium exists in the brine itself. That's a rough description of that, but it ends up being hugely important because some formations don't have a lot of brine. I'm just going to cut to this for a moment. Some formations don't have a lot of brine. Some formations have a huge amount of brine, and it turns out that don't have a lot of radium. Some formations have a huge amount of radium, and it turns out that the Marcellus is really rich in radium. So this is a diagram that I put together myself. Again, it really mind-boggling that you cannot find this information presented easily on any government website. It took a lot of research to gather data from all the different plays, but we have it now and we can lay it out, and we see that we see levels, and we see that Marcellus is the highest. So I'm going to go back a slide now to give some context as to what those levels mean. So remember, Marcellus, we have radium as high as 28,500 picocuries per liter. Now, what are our safe levels? And radium is an element, we do know a bit about it. We know it's really dangerous, and the EPA has limits. The safe drinking water limit that EPA has assigned for the combination, we have two different common isotopes of radium, radium-226 and radium-228. So that EPA limit, adding those two isotopes together, is 5. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, this is how much a facility that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission oversees, how much radium can they discharge into the environment. So a nuclear power plant, for example, cannot discharge to the environment a stream of waste that has radium at higher than 600 picocuries per liter, again, for each of these isotopes. And then according to the EPA, this is really significant, liquid waste containing radium-226 or 228 above 60 picocuries per liter, that's defined as radioactive. So we have various kind of cutoff points here, but they are all well below what we are finding in the Marcellus. And just to give context from the last slide, so a nuclear power plant, if it had Marcellus brine at levels that that have been recorded, this is coming from DEP's own report, if they had that in their discharge pipe, they would not be able to put that out into the environment. There's simply too much radium, and the EPA would absolutely define that as radioactive. And of course, it would be well above this drinking water limit. Just going to go back to this slide, which explains a little bit about what radium is. The image at the left is from this really phenomenal research paper from 1931 by Harrison Martlin, who was the medical examiner in northern New Jersey, where there was a factory of radium dial painters. So these are the people known as the radium girls, and they used a radium-based paint to make the dials on watches and clocks glow. And to do that, they were painting, dipping the brush into the paint, and then often they would lick the tip of the brush to keep it firm, and that way accidentally ingested quite a lot of radium. And because of this situation, we know a good bit about what radium does to the human body. It accumulates in the bones. Radium mimics calcium. It's on the same column of the periodic table as calcium. So the body actually takes it into the body, thinking it's calcium, thinking it's something helpful. It's not. It's a radioactive metal, which means it will continue to decay, blast off radioactivity inside your body. And Harrison Martland showed that if you ingest enough radium, it will cause cancer. This is done and settled. He did autopsies on more than a dozen radium girls, and they developed cancers in very specific spaces. And the rest of this paragraph is just to show that you're not done at radium. The whole concept behind radioactivity is you have an element, it blasts off a little piece of itself. That's what we call radiation. And it's literally, it's lost a piece of itself, so it's become something new. And in the case of radium, the something new is another radioactive element, radon. And radon continues to go through this cycle, and radon blasts off a bit of radioactivity and it becomes another element, which also happens to be a radioactive element. So when you're ingesting radium, you're ingesting like an entire nuclear chain, and it's going to continue to blast off radioactivity and eventually become one of the most scary radioactive elements around. Polonium-210, this is what was used to kill former Russian spy Alexander Litvinenko by placing less than a grain of sand in his tea. And I mean, polonium-210 is extraordinary. Less than 40 sugar packets worth could kill everyone on Earth. So these other elements often aren't talked about. We often, if we dig into this research, we hear about the radium, but inherently, if you have the radium, you have everything else below the radium, and the things below the radium are really scary as well. Now getting into that a little deeper, and this becomes, I think, really a core question. So we know radium kills. Harrison Martland, looking at the radium girls, showed that. That is part of fact now. But what happens at the lower levels found in the Marcellus? And so if you look at the left here, we can see, this is from a Department of Energy report, Radium in Humans, another kind of lovely report that I've digested for you all, but if you feel like getting into this, it has a lot of information. But again, it cites some of its most important information from Harrison Martland, who looked at the radium girls. What we learn here is that they ingested a good bit more radium than is found in brine. So we can't say that the levels that the radium girls took in are the levels in brine. But what we can say is like, well, they're a good bit lower, and radium does a great harm at high levels. So what's happening at lower levels? There's simply not a lot of research on that, which is problematic. But we do have a couple really concerning examples. And one is the paper listed at the right. This is something that needs to be talked about much more. It's a really important paper. It was passed to me by a nurse in southwestern Pennsylvania. And I recently spoke to the researcher, Murray Finkelstein. He's still around. So what Dr. Finkelstein did is he looked at this part of Ontario where there's higher levels of radium in the drinking water. We're not dealing with any sort of industry contamination, simply an area, a naturally occurring radium. It's a little bit higher in this region. And he thought, well, I know that at high levels, radium can cause cancers. Let's look at low levels and see if there's any changes. And he looked across a large population, and he had this stunning result, which is that a minor increase in the level of radium in drinking water actually had a statistically significant correlation to the level of Ewing sarcoma in youths. We all know, or many of us probably know, there's a Ewing sarcoma cancer cluster ongoing now in southwestern Pennsylvania. And this is really, really important research, and it really gets mentioned. And this is why I think it's so important that the state clearly must look at oil and gas waste as they study the issue of the Ewing sarcoma cluster. But yes, more research absolutely does need to be done. But the point is, we have, published in premier journals by prominent scientists, we do have evidence to indicate that even tiny amounts of radium, much less than what the radium girls dealt with, may be problematic. So yeah, we're dealing with this problematic radioactive element in oil and gas waste. We have billions of gallons of it coming up every day. Who's regulating it? No one. And this is just a list of different agencies all telling me in different bureaucratic bureaucratic speak terms, like we're not doing anything on this. OSHA, no. DOT, no. EPA, no. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, not in our bag, and on and on. It's really it's a tragedy. This is something some folks may be aware of. We have all these different exemptions that enable the oil and gas industry to really exist. But this, in my opinion, is the mother of all exemptions. It's the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, Benson and Bevel Amendment exemption. And essentially what this exemption does is it brands oil and gas waste, such as brine, such as these drill cuttings, it brands it as non-hazardous. Even though EPA well knew that there's all these different hazards, including radioactivity in oil and gas waste, right here in their own language, they say that if we called it hazardous, which it should be called hazardous, it would cause a severe economic impact on the industry and on oil and gas production in the US. So we're going to have to call something we know as hazardous, non-hazardous, just so this industry can exist. And many of the problems I'm talking about tonight stem from this decision, which, by the way, the EPA continues to defend, even though, and we'll get to that, massive amounts of evidence to show that, of course, this waste is hazardous and hugely problematic. So how might this radioactive metal, carcinogenic radioactive metal, radium, be getting into our water and our bodies from oil and gas development? And there's so many pathways. And I just to connect back to where you all are with the fracking ban in the Delaware River area, these are pathways having to do with oil and gas waste, right? So we're far from the wellhead. And this is why I think it's so important that folks understand that this contamination exists far beyond the wellhead. Many problems there, but we're in trucks driving to various sites such as injection wells, such as landfills, such as treatment plants. And this is where we still have the potential for a huge amount of contamination. So spills, of course, a truck can crash. That happens often in Ohio. A truck carrying brine actually crashed right beside a reservoir. It was a nightmare scenario that activists in that area had predicted, and eventually it did happen. And treatment plants, I'm going to go into a bit more detail on that because this is really a huge disaster. The industry likes to brag that they're recycling the brine, this is a great thing for everyone, and they reuse it. Well, treatment plants end up contaminating not just the environment, but human beings. We'll get to that. It's still legal in many states, and the state in many legislators in Pennsylvania are actually fighting to make this easier. For a time in Pennsylvania, dumping of radioactive oilfield brine on roads was banned, but the state legislature there is fighting to take away that ban. And in Ohio, the state legislature is actually fighting to enable it easier to make products out of radioactive oilfield brine. I mean, that is extraordinary. When I tell that to researchers in other countries, their jaw drops. I mean, we've got an issue with brine, right? But that we're intentionally spreading it on the roads in front of the public sphere is really deranged. So let's just go on and see, what does the science say? I mean, is this just a journalist crying wolf, or is there a lot of science behind this? And of course, I draw my information from the science. There's a huge amount of science. The research community, it's not a massive community such as the community studying climate change, but it's a prominent community, and they have looked at oilfield waste across the US, and I just posted some of the most significant examples, but they've showed what I think is so significant here. That radium from oilfield waste, so from brine, the radium we've just been talking about in brine, it will persist in the environment. It doesn't just disappear. Radium has a half-life, by the way, of 1,600 years. And these researchers, they haven't had that long to see, is it still there at the end of its half-life? But we know it's there 3, 4, even 5 years later. And we also know that it flows downstream. And so even in the first example, 4.5 miles away, the USGS found that radium from a spill site can persist in the environment. So we're already moving well past. This is a tiny little, atom, tiny little element, it's moving well past the spill site and we're contaminating areas downstream. Just how far downstream hasn't necessarily been canvassed with the research yet, but we know it does move downstream. And then the final example I gave, another really significant example, really clever study. Penn State researchers knew that there are these treatment centers that were putting oil field waste back out into Pennsylvania waterways. They thought, well, where is it going to accumulate? Let's look behind a dam. Let's look in a reservoir, which the public uses for fishing and boating. Let's look in the layers of sediment behind the reservoir because the dam blocks the sediment. They thought maybe things would accumulate in that location, and sure enough, it did. And they found oil and gas waste, and that was 10 to 19 kilometers downstream. So there we're talking, like 6 to 12 miles. So it's moving within our water systems. And I think this is just really significant. The EPA, as much as have not directly answered my questions on this issue, I know ignore many of you, they have actually put out a study that is really significant, and I think needs to get more play. So this is in 2018, and at right, you see the citation there, this like secret little paper. And please, I mean, Jesse Pritt, the author, deserves props because Jesse actually looked at this and did the study. And we get this a lot from regulatory agencies. There might be a study where really good science is done, but there's no press release for that study. There's no, banner or flag waving it around. It's kind of like pushed behind the curtain. And I was not even able to interview Jesse. They wouldn't let me, but I read the study, and the study shows that these oil and gas waste treatment centers, which are almost always located on waterways, they are absolutely contaminating the waterways in a variety of really concerning ways. They're contaminating the species that live in the waterways. And then we have drinking water intakes in these waterways, and there's contamination there. So, really significant, I think, to note. And this is something, when you go back to these agencies, you can say, well, your own science actually shows this. So why in this A, B, or C instance are you acting otherwise? Because you all know that this is a problem. They know that oil field waste is absolutely contaminating the waterways in and even outside of the oil and gas development region. Now this, I'm just going to hold it on this paper, and I'm almost done here, but this is really like the highlight of the evening. So we have, the current science I just presented. We have the pretty recent EPA science, but it goes so much further back. This paper is amazing. So 2006, the preeminent US Geological Survey geologist, so we're talking about a really respected government agency, government scientists, put together a bibliography of all the historic research documenting oilfield brine contamination. So we can call it oilfield brine, oilfield waste, produced water, all the contamination from this specific waste stream in communities and the environment. This is just a list. It's not all the papers like stacked together with their abstracts and bodies. It's just a list, and it's 223 pages long. So there is so much evidence to show that produced water, brine, oil and gas wastewater is massively harmful for the environment. And I've just laid out a couple screenshots of that paper, and you can Google this paper. There's the title right there. If you put that in with James Odden and Google it, you should find the actual paper there. But again, you'll just find a list of all these other papers, many of which you can be led to. And so just reading from the top, effects of oilfield brine effluent on benthic organisms in Trinity Bay, Texas, American Petroleum Institute. So the American Petroleum Institute actually knows that oilfield brine has an effect on benthic organisms. And that's a good one to highlight for you all. These, the things that living at the bottom of estuaries, for example, it is affected by oilfield brine. The industry knows it, and that's from 1977. And it goes on and on. It's just incredible when you really start to dig in how much evidence is stacked against this industry. And yet they go forward. And the American Petroleum Institute, now I'm in touch with their spokespeople. I'm sure they have no idea that paper even exists. So why it's so important for me to present to everyone. The one last thing I want to focus on is this idea of oil field waste treatment. And I mean, I get a little bit comical with this, but it's really not funny at all. What you have here at the left are pictures taken by the Ohio Department of Natural Resources of a variety of different oil and gas waste treatment centers. And so it is, you can say, oh, recycling, that's great. Well, often what is happening, if you look at that middle picture, the brine is very sludgy and gunky stuff in many instances. It might be put into a pit such as that. The idea would be to settle out the solids, and then the liquid towards the top is the stuff you're going to, quote, reuse. But look at the mess. I mean, this is not a clean process. This might look good on paper. I visited many of these sites in many different oil and gas plays around the country. It's always a sloppy disaster. So do not be fooled by this idea that treatment, that the oil and gas industry is taking care of this stuff. And again, these treatment facilities can pop up on the fringes of oil and gas fields, absolutely in eastern Pennsylvania and parts of New York. And that's why it's so important to understand, as I know you all are, the full curtain of this industry. And this is what's happening to the workers. So they might have to go into these tanks, go into these pits, clean things off, typically no respirator. Even if they are given a respirator, often there's kind of a macho battle back and forth between them and their boss, and the boss, knows that if anyone really tries to push them on PPE, they're just going to fire them. And these are actual stories told from workers. And they will end up looking like that. And often those clothes will end up being washed with their children's clothes, their family's clothes back at home. This is the same brine that may have, radium at levels that we just looked at, and they're soaked in it, and they'll be doing that every day. So you're not just, harming estuaries, which is a major issue. You're absolutely harming the workers who are dealing with this waste as well. And again, the American Petroleum Institute knew that treatment was just completely inappropriate 40 years ago. Just a few quick quotes from another really important paper, 1982 paper of the American Petroleum Institute. And note at the bottom, by the way, I think that's significant. It's the American Petroleum Institute's Department of Medicine and Biology. Did not know they had one. But here they are saying any control methodology proposed for radioactive materials must recognize that radioactivity cannot be modified or made inert by chemical means. You cannot just remove the radioactivity. It's a pretty simple statement. You can't just make it go away. But the API, the American Petroleum Institute, is reminding their member groups how difficult it is. You can't just, quote, treat this stuff. It's still there. Even if you successfully remove the radioactivity from the waste stream, well, congratulations, you have now concentrated the radioactivity into a different form. So what are you going to do with that? And the American Petroleum Institute is reminding folks of that 40 years ago. We're going back even earlier now, a Shell paper. All these different oil and gas companies had these research labs throughout the 50s. Shell had one in California. And here's a note from a toxicologist: certain problems of environmental cancer in the petroleum industry. This paper is extraordinary because I'm just going to read this one line right here. Despite the observation that tar products, oil and gas products account for the majority of environmental cancer in man. Here's Shell admitting that oil and gas accounts for the majority of environmental cancer in humans. Another one that I just wish more people were talking about this paper. A more current paper from, now we're going international, the International Association of Oil and Gas Producers. A lot of amazing information, really important information about worker harms, largely worker harms in this paper. I've shown this paper to many people working in the Marcellus, working in the oil and gas industry in the US. And it's just so sad. They have seen nothing of this paper. This paper has some really good information for them, and they have no idea it exists. Yet another industry report. This is talking about radioactivity risks connected more to downstream infrastructure, to pipelines, to compressor stations, and really raising, an industry expert raising the alarm about this issue. not necessarily having to do with brine, different issue, but still dealing with oil field radioactivity. It's an important paper. Lastly, I wanted to mention for you all, this is really significant. The Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection has this TNORM report. If you dig into this issue, it's one of the first state papers you'll come to. And the conclusion is right there at the top. There's little or limited potential for radiation exposure. They throw this around left and right. Other state agencies requote it. But if you look into the guts of this paper, you actually see that the DEP has listed all sorts of harms from radioactivity, including leachate from landfills. And so someone had asked about this, and I just want to go back a couple slides to this EPA paper, because the EPA knows this too. So this is so important. And we're looking at the third point here: removal of barium and co-precipitation of radium may create a solid waste management issue at CWT. These are centralized waste treatment facilities treating oil and gas extraction waste, and result in solid waste that exhibits radioactivity at levels that preclude disposal in most landfills. In addition, it is plausible that radioisotopes and wastewater treatment residuals disposed in landfills may subsequently be released to the environment through leachate. So there's EPA in their own words saying, you know what, we do think if we follow this thing through, the waste ending up in the landfills, it's going to end up in the environment via the leachate. They say that in their own words, and it's extraordinary. They're still then on the other, through their other mouth, trying to fight this. And I think I'd love to get questions. It's always so important to hear what people say. So just ending it here, another quote from really one of my heroes in this, Dr. Harrison Martland, again, who looked at the Radium girls. And after Dr. Harrison Martland, you know, he's a medical examiner. He looked at all sorts of issues, all sorts of ways of dying. But after studying the Radium girls, he comes up with this sentence, you know, I'm now of the opinion that the normal radioactivity of the human body should not be increased. So this is recognized, and you'll get this pushback from the industry. Well, there's more radioactivity in a banana. Well, radioactivity is everywhere. Yes, it's true. We do live on a mildly radioactive planet, and it's actually killing us in small numbers, whether we like it or not. But here's Dr. Harrison Martland, who studied human beings affected by radiation more so than pretty much anyone else, and saying, acknowledging we do live on a mildly radioactive planet, but I really don't think we should increase it at all, because it can lead to malignancy, it can lead to cancers, and other human health problems. So I think, yes, that is a good place to end it. I'm going to stop the share and welcome any sort of questions folks have.
Really quick before we go to our Q&A portion, I would like to talk about what we can actually do to help stop the import of frack wastewater into the Delaware River Basin. Just as a quick introduction, hi everyone, my name is Sahana Rao. I'm an attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council. And I want to quickly emphasize that the information recently revealed about frack wastewater only increases the urgency for all of us to keep working hard to protect our communities and the environment by making sure that DRBC understands that they need to implement a full frack ban. So just as a quick reminder, at last month's webinar, we discussed a report by the Physicians for Social Responsibility, which revealed that highly toxic forever chemicals, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, have been used in fracking. Today, we've learned, thanks to Justin and his great presentation, that frack wastewater also includes dangerous radioactive material that can be released into the environment with consequences for the health of people and ecosystems alike. And despite knowing about this for quite some time, no regulator today has really figured out how to handle this in an appropriately protective way. So we've discussed all this frankly shocking information. Now it's time to do something about it. Given what you've heard today and during the series of webinars presented by the DRBC Frack Ban Coalition this summer, we hope we can count on you to speak out and help convince the Delaware River Basin Commission that they must ban fracking wastewater in the Delaware River Basin. DRBC already banned fracking in the basin because it threatens both public health and the environment, particularly the water supply of over 17 million people. Now, we've got to tell DRBC that it needs to finish the job and fully eliminate that threat by prohibiting the import of frack wastewater. And by clicking on that link that's shown on screen, you can email them exactly that. I believe the link will also be posted in chat and will be emailed out to everyone who attends this webinar and publicized by several of the organizations represented in the DRBC Frack Ban Coalition as well after tonight. I really want to emphasize that Every voice counts, and the time to speak is now. We need every single one of you to contribute to a clear and implacable call for DRBC to heed when it issues its draft gas regulations next month and during the following comment period. Together, we can convince the Delaware River Basin Commission to do the right thing and ban the import of dirty frack wastewater into the Delaware River Basin so that we have a full frack ban. Again, I encourage each of you to follow the link that was just on screen and put in chat and make your concerns known to the DRBC. And hey, if you have friends or family in the area who also care about water quality and protecting the basin, as I know so many people do, and they weren't able to make it tonight because everyone's got stuff going on, feel free to let them know about this as well. You're free to share this link widely as you're able. So thank you all for your continued work to protect the Delaware River Basin. And with that, I will turn the show over to Karen Feridan for some Q&A.
Thank you so much, Sahana, and thank you so much, Justin. We do have a number of questions coming in, so let's get right to them. We had gotten one from somebody who put it in the chat because she's a landowner and she's going through issues in her own property. She wondered, how do we test for radium in water? Who would do that in Pennsylvania? Is a special laboratory you go to, or just how is it done?
That's such a great question. The one would think that the state would be able to do that, but they're not necessarily trustworthy or even going to come and heed your call. The easiest way to get someone to test would be to contact one of the academic researchers in the region who are looking into this. So you have Dr. John Stultz at Duquesne University is probably the one most capable of moving quickly on something like this. I know Dr. Stultz is in touch with many members of the public, of communities, and he recently has new equipment to look for radioactivity. So I would start with there, and he's pretty easy to look up and to contact. Although if someone has difficulty, I can pass you his contact info. There's other researchers as well at Penn State. There's a group at Duke looking at this, but I think if you're in Pennsylvania, I would start with Dr. Stultz. And something that's coming is attorneys are starting to sniff around and look into this. I don't know if that's necessarily a better route, but often if attorneys are looking, they will want to test, and that is one way to get testing. But even them, in many cases, they don't really understand this fully. So start with Stultz. And feel free to reach out to me if you have other questions on that. It's a great question.
Okay, thank you so much. And actually, Helen is asking a question about something I wanted to ask you about as well. Her question sets up what my question would have been, because she's talking about landfills and how landfills don't address radioactive waste. And she's wondering, how can we get some agency to monitor this? But the news is that the DEP is supposed to be starting to monitor this. But there are lots and lots of issues with what they're proposing. And I just wondered if you had a quick overview of what some of your concerns are, or if you've had a chance to look at that in any detail.
Yeah, I think it's great that the DEP is now proposing to look for radium in the leachate stream. You know, what we just laid out as a problem, they are now talking about doing that. I think what we have to do is stay on them, make sure they actually do that. But I also think that the state can take more to create public awareness about this. So for example, in Pennsylvania, many landfills, the leachate is processed by a sewage treatment plant. The sewage treatment plant is not able to remove radium, for example. The sewage treatment plant discharge into a Pennsylvania waterway, and I've been to various sites where that discharge goes into a little creek. A discharge is like a little outlet. It's an outfall, so it digs a hole in the creek often. That's a great place for trout, and people fish there. And so you have people fishing right at the point of these discharges. So another thing I'd love the state to do is to start to put up signs and create awareness that they've created a problem, that you have these discharges going out into the environment, and people who fish, you know, often kids fishing by creeks, they should know this. The community should be made aware, and it's really up to us to push them to put that information out there.
Yeah, in fact, I'm just paraphrasing Penn Environment Digest blog from Dave Hess, a former DEP chief. And his headline is DEP to require radiological testing of leachate at landfills, including those accepting drilling waste, but it does not include additional testing of drilling wastewater. So that just needs to be clarified to people that, there are just all sorts of Swiss cheese holes in this thing. So yes. So I just wanted to move on from that one real quick because we have a number of other questions coming in. Deborah asks if she remembers reading in your Rolling Stone article, perhaps, that old oil and gas pipes were donated for use in playgrounds.
Yeah, absolutely. That was in Louisiana and Mississippi, and in Texas and Louisiana. It was often common, remains common, to use the old pipes for ranches. Ranches cover huge amounts of ground, and so they'll use the pipes to make fencing for ranches. The problem, but the playground issue is really horrific. Because they did it as a gesture of goodwill, like, here we are giving you free stuff. And the issue here is you have radium, like we talked about. You have brine, which has a good amount of radium in it coming up through the oil field piping, right? And you have a lot of pressure changes and temperature changes as you go from deep in the earth to the surface. And so a lot of that radium will end up precipitating out. Radium is a metal, right? And it's also mixed in with other metals such as barium, and it will precipitate out as this hardened mineral deposit called the scale, and that will form on the inside of the oil field piping. And these pipes get so gunked up with scale that the industry every so often has to take the pipes out and clean them, but it turns out the scale is really hard to remove. So what they then did in this example is they just donate the pipes. And yeah, I mean, it's just a horrible example of them being lazy, not being able to remove the radioactivity, and then they give the stuff away for free. Now, one big question is, well, what's happening to the piping in the Marcellus? Is it building up radioactive scale? Is that being cleaned off somewhere? Often the cleaning process is really dirty and spreads radioactivity everywhere in a fine dust wherever it's done, and the workers get really contaminated in that instance. And that's something I'm still looking into. We don't exactly know what's happening to the radioactive oil field piping in the Marcellus. And this is, again, a place where, like, community member eyes are really important. I mean, if you see big pipe yards, not with the new pipe, but with this kind of gunky pipe, if you see strange cleaning operations of piping, I mean, that could start to lead us to an answer to that. But we don't know. What is this industry? What is the Marcellus industry doing with their radioactive oil field piping? I don't know that yet.
We're getting very close to the hour, so I'm going to try to sneak in two real quickly. Are there any studies that focus on the health of oil and gas workers regarding this issue? There was a spree of research in the late 80s and that looked at this issue that I just brought up, pipe cleaners. So these workers who clean the radioactive scale out of piping, and they develop cancers, and those cancers were linked to the radioactivity exposure. And then the kind of research went away, and there has not really been new research that's analyzed the workers' radioactivity exposure. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but no, right now, I can't really think of any papers. And part of the reason is access. Academic researchers don't have the access. They might have the interest, but they don't have the access. State researchers don't have the funding and they don't have the guts to do this. And of course, the industry doesn't want to do this. So unfortunately, the answer to that question, at least in the modern times, as far as I know, is no, there isn't research. And finally, because this is timely, because of things going on in the legislature, what is in the brine sprayed on Bucks County roads in winter instead of spreading salt, sand, and gravel?
What's in the brine?
They're wondering what's in the brine that's currently being spread on our roadways. In other words,
yeah, I don't. So right. It's another really great question to start to ask. There is some brine. It's a tricky word that the industry uses, right? Because there are many forms of brine, and there is brine. There is salty water within the earth that isn't filled with radium, and that can be used as a solution. And often a state agency charged with cleaning roads will create their own brine from salt and water, and that's fine. That is not necessarily going to have radium. So you really have to ask each state agency or county agency, or even if it's like a town highway department, you have to ask them where they get their brine. And if they say it's from the oil field or an operator linked to the oil field, then you can start be concerned. But just because you're using brine doesn't necessarily mean it's oil field brine.
Very quickly before I turn it back over to Tracy, and thank you so much for all those responses, but to that last question, we have this bill passing through the legislature right now, HB 1144, and it's the bill that would allow the spreading of drilling waste on roadways that are paved and unpaved. So it's actually technically illegal right now, not that that doesn't get sort of overlooked sometimes, I'm sure, pardon me, but it would be officially allowed again in this state if HB 1144 passes. And so please pay attention to that bill and how it moves.
No, I think that's a great point. And just to add, I know it's closing. I'm still available, by the way, but I know it's coming up on the hour. But just to add, I mean, I think this is a nice closing note. The industry has a problem with this waste, right? And so as per the example of giving the pipes away for free, they come up with ways where they can get rid of it in the public sphere, and it looks like a good ad. And that is actually part of their playbook. They have too much brine coming up. It's hugely problematic. And so they've tried all sorts of tricks to get rid of it. And that's absolutely why folks, even beyond the oil and gas producing regions, need to be aware, as you all clearly are, because they will try and are trying to get rid of it in any way they can. They can't drill without producing it. And the more we become aware of problems, the more they then will try a different trick to get rid of it.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Tracy now, who's going to take us out.
Thank you. And thank you, Justin. This part was actually going to be covered by Wes Gillingham, but he's representing the Delaware River community at an environmental justice meeting that's being held by the federal government. And he's speaking up for the Delaware River and all of us. So he was going to be doing this. He was signed up and all of a sudden they called him. So he's not here tonight. So what I would like to do, though, is just a couple of closing notes. First of all, have you ever heard of a better reason to ban fracking? Holy moly. But, as we are, at closing us out tonight, we want to invite you to come to the next Delaware River Frack Ban Coalition webinar, because that's going to be on Wednesday, September 15th, next month from 7 to 8 p.m. The title of that one is Water is Life, Don't Waste It on Fracking. And the link to register is functioning now, and it is going to be inserted into the chat box by Peter right now. And it's also going to be sent to everybody who registered for tonight's webinar and a follow-up email with a link to a recording of the webinar so you can see Justin's slides and really study them. And look again at the information that you heard tonight. Also, other links will be provided, as Barbara said at the beginning. Please join us at this next webinar, though, because we're going to be discussing why the export of water to fuel fracking outside of the Delaware River watershed is not only damaging due to its depletion of our precious water, but also unethical, because we don't want Delaware River water to frack up other places. We want that full ban on fracking that we've been talking about. And we want that to include the banning of frack wastewater, which we've discussed here tonight, with this compelling reason to ban it based on Justin's radioactivity investigations. We discussed it on our past webinars, as was mentioned by Sahana, because of PFAS that has now been found, the forever chemicals, to be used in fracking and is in the wastewater, and all the other toxic materials and all the damage that's done as a result of the discharge of wastewater. But we also don't want our water of the Delaware River and its watershed to be exported for fracking. Basically, don't frack with our water. And as we close out, we want to do a special thank you, because I want to thank Justin Nobel. We here at the Delaware River Frack Ban Coalition, we're so thrilled when Justin generously offered to do this webinar with us tonight. And we didn't have to get down on our hands and knees and beg him. He came right along when we asked him. And he's an awesome man and an awesome investigator. And we owe you a lot, Justin. Thank you from all of us. I also want to thank the organizations that comprise the Delaware River Frack Ban Coalition for their unfailing commitment. That's many of you out there who belong to these organizations and all the work that we do together. So those coalition organizations that make up the organizing committee are Berks Gas Truth, Catskill Mountain Keeper, Clean Water Action of New Jersey, Damascus Citizens for Sustainability, Delaware Riverkeeper Network, Environment New Jersey, Food and Water Watch, New Jersey Sierra Club, Natural Resources Defense Council, and the League of Women Voters of Delaware. So thank you all for sticking with this. And thank you all out there for joining us tonight. And please share the email action that Sahana has launched here tonight. The link is available, it's open, and the governors need to hear from us, and President Biden needs to hear from us. We actually have a way to speak with them, so let's all do it together. So as we're leaving tonight, you're going to see the photos that Taylor McFarland of New Jersey Sierra has assembled from the snapshots that have been submitted to our Vacation in the Basin Photothon that Barbara talked about at the top. And we're going to be submitting this slideshow to the DRBC to show the commissioners what we're fighting to protect. And as we do that, we want you to think about what it is in your fight and your thoughts and your heart and soul about the Delaware River that you're fighting to protect. And I want to show you one last slide, which is next, the webinar for next month. And right there is the bit.ly, and it's in the chat. And now I'm going to turn it over to Taylor, who's going to sing us out with the wonderful snapshots that people are taking and sending in. Thank you all for joining us here tonight. Thank you, Justin Nobel.